Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and natter about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today we're looking at the unofficial and non-canon history of the Minbari as brought to us by a supplement for the Babylon 5 tabletop RPG game. That supplement being the Minbari Federation Fact Book, which was released by Mongoose Publishing. Now, the Babylon 5 RPG was released using the modern D20 rule set, which was based off of 3.5 D&D. That was released in 2003. A second edition of the Babylon 5 game was released in 2006, and in 2008, Mongoose made a remake of the game using their Traveler game series rule set, and the system itself, Babylon 5, was well received. In 2004, it won a Silver Emmy for Best Licensed Product. Just give you an example. If you're interested, you can pick up PDFs of these books on the website DriveThruRPG. I will link that in the description, and they're relatively cheap, but you're going to have a heck of a time finding an actual printed book, and the price is probably going to be a lot higher than you really want to pay. So my advice is going to be stick to the PDFs on this one. The book gives us a full rundown of Minbari history, starting with their prehistoric roots as a primate-like antlered creature who was driven below ground due to a lack of resources and an overabundance of predators, and then their reemergence and growth into a tool-using tribal society, which is when they came to the attention of the Vorlons. The Vorlons are an incredibly old, secretive race locked in conflict with another race called the Shadows. You'll remember I spoke about both of those in the official history video, and I'm going to tell you to watch the show for more information there. In this book, we learned that from day one, the Vorlons interfered with the development of the Minbari species, with their first experiment being the city of Kanate, which was the first city that the Minbari had actually ever built. It was here that the Vorlons taught the Minbari various technologies and were in turn worshipped as gods by the Minbari. This experiment ended in disaster, and the Vorlons had to destroy the city as the Minbari of this city took those technologies that the Vorlons had given them as a mark of divine favor and tried to conquer the world, only to have the surrounding tribal societies unite and overrun them. The Vorlons would basically erase the city and decided to start over, approaching tribes in a more covert manner to guide their development from behind the scenes. It's in this period of history that the Minbari start to drift into different castes based on their interaction with the Vorlons. Some tribes becoming very religious and spiritual in outlook, while others were focused into a more warlike warrior culture. The workers would come from those who were unlucky enough to be conquered and forced into a labor pool. Now, during this period, the Vorlons got distracted by one of their wars with the Shadow, but that's not recorded in the history of the younger races like the Minbari, so no real details in this book. When the Vorlons returned from this war with the Shadows, they decided to embark on a new experiment because they had learned that certain mental interferences caused pain to the Shadows and disabled their weapons. So they decided to create telepaths, and they focused on creating Minbari telepaths and gradually bringing the Minbari into the path of an industrialized society. The Vorlons would take Minbari from the northern tribes of Minbar and bring them into their own space, and through training and experimentation, turn them into near immortal telepathic demigods. The children of these Minbari would inherit many of these gifts, but not at the same level of strength. Meanwhile, the Minbari of the south industrialized and, among other things, invented their first major non-muscle powered projectile weapon, a gear powered device that fired crystal shard. Because of the amount of crystal growths in Minbar, you're going to see a lot of crystal tech in this timeline, guys, so brace yourself. At this point, Excluding the telepathic north, which is still behind a Vorlon weapon system, the world of Minbar was divided between industrializing city-states and tribes. Now, the Vorlons started removing their influence from the south while staying focused on the north. Mainly keeping these two groups away from each other was their biggest concern. Through diplomacy and economics, meanwhile, a group of warrior clans created an alliance, and from that was born the first large nation state of Minbar. But this new nation state had a problem. They were surrounded and outnumbered by enemies who hated them. Their solution? Build a wall. Not just any wall, a massive 16,000-kilometer long chain of fortresses and walls built along a series of geothermal fissures, which they would tap using long cut blocks of crystal that would channel heat up from the depths of the planet Minbar and pull solar radiation from the sunlight to create what they called the Bright Barrier, and it would repel invaders for 3,000 years. Now, to give you context for the size here, the Great Wall of China, the one that was built in the Ming Dynasty that all the tourists go see, that's about 8,000 kilometers long. The entire Great Wall of China, which was actually built over successive dynasties, from what I can find, is actually closer to 21,000 kilometers long. So there is precedent for a chain of fortifications that dang big. Kind of impressive for people who didn't even have bulldozers, right? The Vorlons decide now is the time to allow for interaction, and they pull back almost completely. At this point in history, telepathic society was unified under a small group of immortal god kings and queens, and under them their many, many offspring. Those who were non-telepathic were regulated to brute labor. As the telepaths began to interact with the societies to the south, they realized the sheer amount of advantages they had. And from this, a dream of conquest was formed. They started marching south, and they had vastly superior communications and coordinations as they were literally able to read each other's mind from a distance, and they crushed many in their path. They seemed unstoppable except for the Bright Barrier, because it doesn't matter if you can read somebody's mind if getting within a mile of them gets you instantly incinerated. Now, while the telepaths were unable to breach the Bright Barrier, the other side of this did not dare open up the gates and sortie out because that would get them hammered into the ground. So both sides settled down for a long siege that apparently lasted 1,000 years. And I thought, we had issues letting things go as a species. The impasse was not broken by any action by the Minbari, but by the planet Minbar itself, as a massive earthquake. Minbar quake? I'll let you guys decide. Earthquake or Minbar quake? Which sounds better to you? Broke the Bright Barrier and left it in ruins. It was utterly shattered, but the earthquakes was so substantial, it also wrecked the armies that the telepaths had stationed to watch the barrier. Both sides were so just devastated by this earthquake that all they could do was pull back to their core heartlands as they were staggered by the sheer scale of their losses. The Vorlons didn't like this show of hesitancy in the Minbari and decided they needed to get more hands-on to get things moving. So what they did is they divided the planet into regions, and each region had its own Vorlon who would decide how they would interfere and in what manner, with nobody else saying a word about it. The Minbari reverted, for the most part, back to clan life again, except for the telepaths, who, after a period of recovery, came roaring right back. At this point, there would be 12 god kings and queens of telepath society named Kiraza, and they would not be denied their ambition. They would rule this world, but they'd be more careful about it this time. The Kirazawa engaged in diplomacy, reaching out and recruiting willing followers, along with just pure military conquest in this second attempt. Entire clans proved willing to join up for what were honestly pretty good benefits, as long as you didn't mind that telepaths would always be on the top of the food chain. The remaining cities that had been built behind the Bright Barrier were steadfast in their hostility, however, and there were those who preferred chancy freedom to comfortable serfdom. The war started with the invasion of the Minbari city of Goran, and the battle lasted for weeks. Minbari technology had advanced enough that telepathy was no longer an instant I win button, until one of the Karaza joined the battle directly. Possessing telekinetic abilities that dwarfed Minbari weapons technology of the time, fighting one was like trying to fight a hurricane with a cooked hot dog. However, there are only so many of these metaphorical hurricanes to go around, and the war would spread until every city, tribe, and clan had chosen a side. And while the armies of the anti-telepath coalition had superior numbers and technology, the telepaths of the north had powers that seemed pretty much magical to the Minbari at the time. Any battle where Kirazawa showed up was an instant win for the telepaths, but again, there's only 12 of them, so they can only be at best 12 places at once. So the war dissolves into a series of running battles and guerrilla-style conflicts, with Southerners striking wherever they're sure the Karazawa aren't, and the Karazawa constantly hunting intelligence to pin down and eliminate large groups of their opponents. After about 50 years in an explosive ambush, Akiraza is slain. Their death throes shatter the mind of everybody within a mile, but the cost was considered acceptable. The pressures of the war had forced almost everyone into a completely nomadic lifestyle. Has settled life just invited large-scale armies to crash on top of your head? The Southerners conducted a year-long campaign to move their armies into two main forces, to strike at the telepaths with one goal: to isolate and kill the Kiraza. It was a bloodbath, but in the opening hours they caught two of them and killed them. This brought the wrath of the remaining Kiraza, except for one who remained in the capital as a final failsafe. And those remaining Kiraza fell on their enemies like an avalanche. In doing so, they walked right into a trap and they were all killed. This, however, left that half of the Southern Army completely wrecked. But it was only half of the Southern Army, and the other half of that army started an assault on the capital of the telepathic empire. The last of the Kiraza felt her friends and family die. The only people in the world that she could regard as her peers. People she had known for centuries. The closest only thing she could consider family. She went mad, ordered the gates of her city thrown open, and due to being bred to obedience for centuries, her followers obeyed without a second thought. She marched out of her palace and went to war on everyone. It didn't matter who these people were before this day. Any Minbari was now a target to her. Eventually, she was killed. But before she went down, she took out pretty much every living thing in and around the city. This would traumatize the surviving Minbari beyond belief, on top of their other experiences in the war, and they reacted by enacting what can only be called a genocide on the surviving telepaths. I'm not going to try and justify that. I'm just going to ask, how would you feel in their shoes, right? The Vorlons at this point realized that their experiment was a miserable failure, and they scrambled to save as many telepathic children from this purge as they could. They did this by taking mundane families, mind-wiping them so they would consider the telepathic children as their own, and then turning around and doing the same thing to the children so they wouldn't break cover. At this point, the Vorlons decided that trying to work beyond the scene was only creating more failures, so it was time to try the direct approach again. The Vorlons openly contacted the Minbari, and in an interesting 180 went full disclosure, including their role in creating the Minbari telepaths that had twice tried to conquer the world. This did not go over well. The Minbari were also able to connect the dots and realize that many of their older gods were really just Vorlons in disguise. This left the Minbari pissed. I mean, I can't really blame them on this. Imagine finding out your most treasured beliefs and traditions were just lies and deceptions from an alien race running an experiment. And yeah, most people would just be insanely angry. I'm a practicing Christian. If I found out Jesus was an alien YouTube prank or something, I would completely lose my shit. So I understand where they're coming from here. The Minbari had learned a lot of lessons beforehand, though, and instead of having a public freakout, they decided that they would bide their time, and they worked to learn as much technology and science as the Vorlons would teach them. Now, the Vorlons were delighted by this and thought, hey, finally things are working out. This is great. But they would come to regret this, because when the Vorlons taught the Minbari how to create their own spacecraft, complete with an understanding of artificial gravity and energy weapons, letting the Minbari skip generations of technological progression, the Minbari thought, now's the time. And by time, I mean the time to rise up and kill every Vorlon on Minbar. And I'm going to be honest here, I feel the Vorlons kind of deserve this one. Of course, the Vorlons felt differently and flipped out, completely bombarding the surface of Minbar, destroying every Minbari city and population center they could find, with the only scattered survivors those who fled underground into the caverns of Minbari and huddled there, praying to whatever they could that they would be spared this alien expression of wrath. Once the guns fell silent, the Vorlons realized what they had done, and they felt guilt, remorse, shame. They had taken on the job to guide and protect the younger races, and here they were genociding one in a fit of rage. They realized that they had completely failed in their role as mentors to the Minbari, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The Vorlons found the survivors, and they took steps to ensure that the Minbari would be able to survive, rebuild, and achieve new heights. And then, in what I believe was a little bit of self-service, they erased the existence of the Vorlon race from the memories of the Minbari, instead letting the Minbari believe that this devastation had been done to themselves by themselves. They left caches of information and technology for the Minbari on the surface, and then they withdrew. The Vorlons decided they had lost the right to influence the Minbari any further and would at least attempt to avoid any further manipulation of Minbari society. For now, the Minbari would rebuild and repair their ravaged world, although it took generations. They even used genetic engineering to create a subspecies for deep space work and life as they expanded into the rest of their star system. After a handful of centuries, they found the hyperspace gate at the edge of their system, and the Minbari, who at this point had rediscovered gravity technology, headed off for the stars. They mapped out nearby star systems, created colonies, encountered less advanced races who they opened diplomatic relationships with. They even fought a brief war with one species, subjugating them when the species decided that the thing you do on first contact is attack the more advanced species that has flown a spaceship into your solar system. It's at this point that the Minbari attract the attention of the Shadows and were drawn into the Great War. If you watch the official history video, you know what happens next. And to be honest, I'm just going to tell you to go back and watch that part because we're not going to retread old ground here. I hope you found this video informative or at least entertaining. If you did, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or even subscribing, as that helps me out in my eternal battle with the Dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like to support the channel more directly or have a vote on future content, consider joining my Everwise patrons. Link in the description. Special thanks goes to Big Steve, my biggest patron supporter. Now, my next video won't be until June. In May, there will be a couple written book reviews and guest reviews at my written site, also linked below. But otherwise, I'll be focusing on getting ready for this summer because in June, when I return, we're going to do a 4-month-long look at the myth of Atlantis, and I hope to see you there. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.